All right, we are moving on to Egypt. So, as a reminder, don't forget to do your discussion boards. Your discussion boards need to be 200 words long, not a regurgitation of information, but rather your take, your understanding, what you've learned on the topic. 200 words on that, and then you need to respond to two other people with 75 words each. And again, something deeper than just, yes, you are right. So let's dive into Egypt. Um, Egypt is crucial to civilization as we know it. There's no getting around that. There's no escaping the influence that Egypt has had in creating humanity as we know it. And a large part of that was because of the stability of Egypt. When we talked last chapter about the Mesopotamia region, okay, uh, there were there were the Assyrians and the Hittites and the Babylonians and cultures rising and falling. Egypt lasted, okay, and it is that very permanence, that very ability to stay relatively unscathed. Dynasties rising and falling, yes, okay, but the culture staying together and unified and being one thing that lasted for 3,000 years. Think about that. Think about that period of time, 3,000 years. 3,000 years ago, Christ hadn't been born yet, okay, from our perspective. And so the fact that you think about how long Egypt lasted, it's amazing. It's absolutely amazing. So let's dive into the chapter. So page 69, we talk about the sarcophagus, okay, which is the coffin that held one inside the other, the four little shrines, and then this solid gold mask over the face of the body. This is often what we see when we look at representations. Um, Looking at page 70, a huge part of the reason that Egypt was able to stay so stable was because of the cyclical nature and the stable cyclical nature of the weather and the impact that that had with the flooding. So, rains caused the Nile to rise and flood the Nile Delta, okay, which left behind this beautiful, rich soil, okay. Uh, and this soil was so fertile that they were able to grow more than enough food for the entire population. Um, and then uh, sometimes, of course, you'd have too much flooding, in which case the silt would get wiped away, or not enough, and the floods actually wouldn't bring that rich dirt to the surface. So you could have famines as a result of that. Um, and because of these annual floods, this silt was this very rich black color. It was called Kemet, which meant the black land. Meanwhile, if you go beyond the delta, of course, we get into more of the desert, okay? And the desert we think of as this horrible, inhospitable place. Granted, difficult to live. However, because of that, you had all of these mineral resources, okay? These valuable mineral resources, um, different types of stone, etc., that could be quarried and used for a variety of projects. So the wonderful thing about Egypt and why it was able to last for so long is because on one hand you have adequate food, and on the other hand you have minerals and resources for trade and building. Okay, so the combination of those two allowed Egypt to last for a long time. It's usually the failure of one of those that causes a civilization to fail. Egypt had both in abundance. Um, Now, Egypt kind of went through three major periods. Historians divide them into three major periods: the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, and the New Kingdom. Okay? Now, during the Old Kingdom is when the basic traditions, okay, the religion was formed. And throughout everything that followed. Okay, and the Old Kingdom, about 2600 to 2124 BCE, so a period of a good 550 years, right? Five different dynasties were a part of this. Um, the basic fundamentals of Egyptian culture were formed. And then we had an intermediate period of about 80 years. Okay, Egypt was divided between the northern and the southern kingdom. And if we think about that, right, the northern and the southern kingdom, we talked about this division between food and resources, right? And so when we talk about a division between northern and southern, the northern kingdom in this case during being ruled through Hyrcanopolis, and the southern one at Thebes. The the division there is really a division between who controls the food and who controls the resources. All right. Now, trade takes place between the two because, hey, one side needs food, one side needs resources. So there's still trade going on. They're just ruled from different locations. During the Middle Kingdom, this is where we see a rise in Egyptian literature and music and all of these beautiful cultural artifacts that get built. Okay, um, and this is a period from about 2040 to 1648 BCE. So again, a period of about 400 years, a long period of stability, right? And Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt are back together. Um, we have a second intermediate period, okay, for about 100 years. Um, Invaders from the outside come in. They conquer parts of Egypt until finally the out of Thebes, right? Out of the southern kingdom, they're finally driven out by the warriors of Thebes. And then we have the New Kingdom, and this is a period from 1540 to 1069 BCE. And during this period, we have again a reunification, an extended period of excellence in art, in excellence in culture, right? And then finally, we fall into kind of this late period as Egypt starts to become the wane. You have the third intermediate period, a lot of rising and falling of not just rulers, but dynasties. Okay, during this period, we have four different dynasties over a period of about 300 years. Okay, and before finally, during the late period from 715 to 332, a lot of invaders from the outside are coming in. So we see how Egypt has this just wonderful, despite the fact of some interruption, this wonderful continuity that allows for just stability, cultural greatness, cultural excellence out of Egypt that is really unparalleled by anything else in the Western world. China is probably the only other thing that we can compare it to in the East, as far as, even though, rise and fall, continuity of culture. Okay, um, so Egypt was a theocracy. Okay, please forgive the yard work in the background. We can hear them blowing stuff out there. Um, so a theocracy, which is a state that's ruled by either a god or a representative of the gods, and the rulers of Egypt were considered to be um, a living representative of the sun god. Okay, um, so the government and the religion were basically the same thing. I mean, they were tied so closely together, you can't separate. There was no separation of church and state. Um, and the Egyptians believed that when they died, they were judged. They were taken, and their heart was placed on one side of a scale, and a feather was placed on the other. And their heart had the weight of the evil that they did in their life. And if their heart was heavier than the feather, then they were condemned in the afterlife. Um, we talked when we talked about Mesopotamia, we talked about flooding, and in Mesopotamia, the flood, the flood of Gilgamesh, the flood of the Ark, was this horrible, horrible thing, right? It was disastrous in its consequences. In Egypt, flooding was eh, actually kind of important, and so the the Egyptians knew that even though that it could be destructive, it was also crucial. And Egypt was very big on balance. This idea that yes, there is bad that happens, but when there's bad, there's good, and out of bad comes good. Cycles, right? This idea of things repeating and coming back, was very important to Egyptian culture, and I think that's one of the reasons why we see a very polytheistic religion in Egypt, much like most places, right? But in Egypt, it was especially important because they had this idea of destruction as a negative, but also destruction as a positive. And so they needed gods to represent both of these both of these extremes. Okay. The most important god in Egypt, Re or Ra, the god of the sun. Okay. Um, Out of which, if we, according to Egyptian mythology, he came out of the mound of silt from the Nile. Okay, and we keep coming back to the Nile as this birthplace. This is the very birthplace of the king of the gods. Um, so the pharaoh was often very closely associated with them, often thought of as a son of the gods. He was referred to as Nefer, which literally means a junior god. I'm a junior god on my way up, right? Um, and so he would then represent and intercede with other gods on behalf of the Egyptian people. And so basically, his ability to communicate successfully with other gods meant life or death for Egyptians, right? If he's not doing his job, if he's not interceding with the gods, then we're going to die. And so, as we look at, perhaps why dynasties fell, it could be people thinking that perhaps that he had lost favor with the gods. One of the most important uh, stories uh, within Egyptian mythology is that of Osiris, Horus, and Isis. And it talks about this story on pages 73 on to 74, right? Osiris, ruler of the underworld, god of the dead, was murdered by his brother Seth, god of storm and violence, chopped him into pieces, threw him in the Nile, right? Um, but Osiris's wife and sister, which the pharaohs were incredibly interbred, led to genetic weaknesses because they would marry their sisters, close cousins, etc. Because gods have to marry gods, uh, and just led to some horrible birth defects and actually some very weak physically and mentally pharaohs. Uh, but Isis, Osiris's wife and sister, put him back together and restored him to life. So Osiris is often associated with the Nile itself. Um, and then their child, Horus, defeated Seth and supposedly became the first king of Egypt. And then, of course, his descendants would be the next king. So the pharaoh is the earthly manifestation of Horus. When the king dies, he becomes Osiris, and his son steps in, and he then becomes Horus. So again, we talk about cycles, right? The cycle of life and death from Osiris to Horus, back to Osiris, back to Horus, constantly moving through. Um, all right. On 74, we look and we see some of the principal Egyptian gods. Go ahead and go over those. Take a look at those. Horus, Seth, Thoth, Khnum, Hathor, Sobek, and Re. And notice how they show the composite view, okay? To where it's like a three-quarters view, right? The Egyptians felt this was the most characteristic view, and so they used this commonly. A mastery of this form, if you were an artist, was crucial. So face, arms, legs, feet in profile, left foot in front of the right, and eye and shoulders, front view. Okay? Mouth, navel, hips, knees in three-quarter view. Okay, this was supposed to be the most natural perspective. All right, Old Kingdom. So we see one of our first large tombs here. Um, and Egyptians believed in this concept of Ka, which is the eternal soul, right? This living force that would go on. It's really a kind of a life force, okay? Everybody possessed it at the same time as their physical body, right? And the body provides it with individuality, okay? Um, and then the personality of the person is called the ba. So you have to preserve the body so that you have both ka and ba together even after you die. And so this is why we have these pyramids. It's because these are things that then get passed on into the next life. Within the pyramids, you often, as the body is preserved to keep the ka and ba together, there is then things placed within the pyramid so that people still have access to them, such as food, such as favorite jewelry, etc., etc. Um, okay, we look at looking at 76. Um, we see the uh, this idea of the hieroglyphs. Okay, and hieroglyphs are an incredibly complex form of communication, um, and really one of the earliest forms of writing, but in pictograph form through representation, and breaking them down was a complex task. And we're going to get more to that when we go further. But it comes from the hieroglyphs comes from the Greek terms hieros, which means holy, glyphian, which means to engrave, so really holy writing. Um, and there's three kinds of signs. You have the pictograms, which are stylized drawings representing objects or beings combined to form a more complex thought. Phonograms, which represent sounds, and determinatives, which tells you what this category this thing belongs to. Um, so, it's not a surprise that you had to be a scribe in order to write this thing. It started off with only about 700 different signs, but over time expanded up to to right around 5,000. Okay. Um, okay. Moving on to the pyramids of Giza, onto 78. These, we think again, we talked about the Hanging Gardens of Babylon as one of the wonders of the ancient world. The pyramids of Giza were one of the others. Just these amazing, amazing monumental works. The earlier pyramids of the Old Kingdom were these stepped pyramids, right? And we moved from these stepped pyramids into this very smooth uh, pyramid shape, four sides, rising basically straight up. Um, and the complexity of the build with these for an ancient culture is just absolutely astounding. Khufu's pyramids, what was the earliest and the biggest. It's 479 feet high. That's roughly the equivalent of almost a 50-story building. Um, and it took about 2.3 million stone blocks, each weighing between 2 to 5 tons in order to create. Just an absolutely astonishing work of engineering to pull together. They were possibly dragged up the side of the pyramids is one thought as to how that these were created. Dragged up ramps made of rubble with a lime clay called taffel. Okay, keep that in mind. Or possibly levered up, much in the way that we talked about with Stonehenge and the lintel stones being raised up. Although obviously getting it up, you know, 500 feet is a much different task than getting it up 20. Um, we also see the Great Sphinx here. And the Sphinx, of course, we've all seen images of the Sphinx. It is the largest statue ever made in the ancient world. And when we looked at the pictures of the gods back on 74, right, you notice they had the body of a human with the head of an animal, okay? And with the Sphinx, we see the inversion. Okay, we see the body of the animal with the head of a man, and this the Sphinx is probably um, uh, representative of Khafre, the son of Khufu, who the Great Pyramid is dedicated to. And of course, so because we see kind of the same blending of human and animal, this is representing his godhood. Okay, not on the level of the other gods. Okay, he doesn't have the body of a human and the head of the animal. He's flipped. So still a junior god. Okay, but still nonetheless very godlike. Um, and the process of the creation of sculpture was really considered to be almost a sacred thing. The word, as mentioned in the book, the word for creating a sculpture in Egyptian is the same as the word for giving birth. So there's literally this process of a coming forth from the sculptor. Okay, um, sculpture was a very big deal in ancient Egypt, and some of the works that were done they're just beautiful. I mean, just the artistic value of these pieces is fantastic. Um, and of course, looking at the person's ka, the essence of what they are within the sculpture. Um, so there were three main types of sculpture that are discussed and focused on. Seated figure, looking directly ahead, feet side by side, one flat on the knee, the other in a fist. Okay? So we can look at this in a variety of ways as to what this might represent, but usually when we see a fist, we see power, right? Seated on the throne, okay? Um, Straightforward. So again, a very powerful pose. Then we see the standing figure, a gaze in the distance, left foot forward, both hands along the body. Again, fist clenched, okay? Power, looking out over that which we rule. And then a figure seated on the ground with legs crossed. First two, okay, a kingly representation. Whereas the other one seated on the ground, that's not the king, that's the scribe. Okay, but scribes were so important. I mean, we looked at how complex the system of writing was and what it took to just be able to put that together. So this would be some of the various ways of creating and representing kings. Okay. Now, when we look at the scribes, when they create the statue of the scribe essentially then ends up, you put that in the pyramid, the scribe ends up serving the king even in death and through eternity. Lower people such as priests, servants, etc., would be made out of less permanent materials, things such as wood, plaster, that type of thing. Okay. As we look at the Middle Kingdom, we have, like I said, we have this this period in between the middle, or between the Old and the Middle Kingdom. We have the intermediate period, and the Old Kingdom collapsed for reasons that a lot of cultures do. Drought, right? Not enough food. Weakened kingship, possibly a result of interbreeding. Local authorities took over more and more control of what was going on, right? So as the kingship basically hands over more authority to local rulers, they're less needed, okay? And so all of these leads to a period of about 150 years where really there wasn't that unified Egypt that we saw before. So the Southern Kingdom and had a ruler rise up, okay, Mentuhotep II, who ruled the Southern Kingdom, conquered the Northern Kingdom, and reunited them. and the primary capital stayed in Thebes in the south. Although you had some of the outer cities close by, Luxor, well known. We heard of Luxor Casino, right? Karnak, etc. Um, and in the Old Kingdom, literature really served the purpose of it was religious, okay? There really wasn't the storytelling that we think of as part of literature. Um, so during the Middle Kingdom, though, they moved away from that. Writing became more of a source of storytelling and creativity, and it thrived during this time. Um, Especially stories of the supernatural, but also instructive literature, poems, biographies, history, science. Um, just a wonderful, wonderful period of time in Egypt for the growth of knowledge. Um, Sculpture, um, we see a lot of the same figures, the same poses. But one of the things that we see is the use of a grid system in order to create scaled figures, right? So they would draw out a figure. So they draw out a figure on a small scale, and they say, okay, this is an inch, and this is an inch, and this is an inch. And then when they would go larger, what was an inch becomes a foot, but everything stays within scale. And so they were able to take a small figure and make it much larger using the grid system. Um, we look at the symbol of the Ankh, okay, which is a symbol of life, and they talk about it, but I don't see an image of it. I want you guys to look up an image of an Ankh, okay? Ankh, a very important Egyptian symbol that sticks around through, well, even still today. We see images of the Ankh within Western culture among those who look into alternative spiritualities. Um, One of the things about Egypt, well, it is true that there were predominantly male rulers. We do see several female rulers that become important. We've heard, of course, of Nefertiti, Cleopatra. The book talks about Hatshepsut, sorry, um, who became regent for her son, Thutmose III, and basically ruled for about 20 years. And one of the things you see with images of her as it goes further along is she looks less and less like a woman the further things go along, to the point to where they even images of her even have the little square beard. So women could rise to prominence within Egyptian culture. It wasn't common, but it wasn't unheard of, and it wasn't necessarily completely rebelled against, as we might see in some other cultures. Um, all right. One of the things we've come to think of the ruler of Egypt as the pharaoh. Okay, which, yes, okay, they were called the pharaoh, but that's one term, and it's not necessarily the only term, or even necessarily the most commonly used term to them. Um, for example, if we say that something was done by the president, we'll say, well, the White House said such and such, okay? And that's really what the term pharaoh meant. The great house, okay? Well, the great house said da 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 da. So it was a slang term that had some use. Um, we've come to use that term because in script in the Bible, right? That was what the people who wrote the Bible used to refer to the ruler. And so, because the Bible's become so pervasive in Western culture, that's what we say. Um, some terms that I just want you to make sure you get from page 86, colonnade, pylon, hypostyle hall, and the sanctuary. Okay, where sanctuary, where the statue of the deities were placed. Just take a minute to look over those. Make sure you know those terms. Okay. Um, Oh, okay. So let's talk about Ramses Pylon Gate at Luxor. All right, Luxor, as we mentioned, right outside of Thebes. Okay, it's still an important city of its own right, but not the capital. Think of it as a suburb. Um, and he made this beautiful gate that described the king's victory over the Hittites, and it had everything there. Right, it just showed how, man, we really kicked the Hittites' ass. He didn't. Um, he won, but it wasn't this great and wonderful victory where the Hittites just were like, "Oh, you killed us all, we're dead." So it was actually an early example of propaganda, right? If you tell the story that this is what happened, and look, it's right there in the picture, right? That's how it happened. Then everybody's going to buy it. So this is an early use of a propaganda device in order to sway people's thoughts. Oh, shoot. Something that I need to go over really quick, really quick, really quick. Page 82, guys. Page 82. The Rosetta Stone. I apologize. I just realized that I skipped over that. You need to know the Rosetta Stone because the Rosetta Stone, the way it worked is things were written down in three different languages. You had Greek, Demiotic, Egyptian, and then hieroglyphs. Okay? Now, people didn't speak. We didn't know. People didn't know what the hieroglyph said, but because people knew how to read the Greek, and because people knew how to read the Demiotic Egyptian, they were able to, slowly piece together the hieroglyphs. And the Rosetta Stone is so important for our ability to finally understand what was going on in hieroglyphs. It was a slow, painstaking process, bit by bit, to come to understand it. But the Rosetta Stone, because things were written in three languages, not just one to the other, but three, they were able to finally start piecing it together. Okay, let's look at page 89. Now, this is where we talk about mummification, okay? And we've probably all seen, like, The Mummy and movies like that about the idea of the Ka and the Ba still animating the body, right? The process of mummification, oh my gosh, such an elaborate, complex, not just ritual, but, again, just the understanding of the human body and what it would take to preserve it to where, there's still beautifully preserved bodies that were mummified being brought up. So, taken to a place called a place of purification, washed with natron, which this natron absorbed the fluids from the body, okay? Because liquid eventually breaks things down. So you've got to dehydrate it, right? You got to desiccate the body in order to preserve it long term. Then it's taken to the house of beauty, where it's embalmed and all the organs are taken out and dried. Okay, and some of the times they put some of the organs back in jars, right? Those organs were dried out, coated in resin, and put in containers or back inside the body. But if they were put inside the body, they were wrapped with linen, because that linen would help absorb any moisture. Okay, again, moisture is the enemy when you're trying to preserve something. Think of dried fruit, right? Or beef jerky, right? Beef jerky stays good forever, practically, unless it gets moisture. And then they would they would actually stuff the body with linen to keep its shape so that it didn't fall in on itself, right? And again, linen, what does it do? Absorbs moisture, okay? So after 40 days of going through this process, it was cleaned with spices and perfumes, and then they would put some oil. Now, again, oil is moisture, but it's not water that breaks down. Oil will last much longer. And this also, those of you, like I've got really dry skin, okay? And so you put some type of oil on your skin to help preserve, make it supple, so that it doesn't just, crack. It was then coated with a resin to help waterproof it, to keep it so that it didn't break down over time. Okay, um, and then they fingernails, of course, would fall off during this time period. They'd sew the fingernails back in. They would use artificial eyes in the sockets. Of course, the higher your class, the better eyeballs you got. Um, Much like we do now, makeup would be applied, um, and a wig would be put on. It would be dressed, and then uh, wrapped in bandages. Okay, and again, these wrappings would help keep out everything from bugs to moisture. Okay, keep anything from getting to the body. Um, there's the wrapping process was extensive. The head and the neck, fingers and toes were each individually wrapped. Same for arms and legs that were then tied together. Okay, so the arms and legs were wrapped separately, but then tied together to again help preserve shape. Um, and then they put a scroll with the spells from the Book of Going Forth by Day. We'll talk about that. Um, Between the hands, and then again more resin to help keep any moisture out. Um, they would paint a picture of the god Osiris on the surface. Okay, and again because we talked about the cycle of rebirth with Osiris and Horus, right? So to signify him becoming Osiris. Um, yeah. So as we look at the process of mummification, just this incredibly complex process, well thought through, well developed, obviously well tested to keep the body together. Um, Egyptian music, we don't really know what it sounds like or where what it. We have instruments, but there's not really anything recorded as far as the music itself. Okay. Ba-da-ba-bum. Um, so